When I began writing about the modern world in the 1980s, I warned that Western civilization stood at a precipice, not merely economic or political, but moral. The collapse I witnessed wasn't the dramatic fall of empires we read about in history books, but something far more insidious, the slow dissolution of the very principles that had built our civilization over 2 millennia. Today, as I observe American society grappling with unprecedented cultural confusion, I see the fulfillment of patterns I've studied across centuries of human experience. The question isn't whether we can prevent this collapse, it's already well underway. The question is whether we possess the moral courage to arrest it before it becomes irreversible. What we're witnessing isn't merely political polarization or generational change, but the fundamental abandonment of the Judeo-Christian worldview that once provided our culture with its moral compass. The symptoms are everywhere: the elevation of feelings over facts, the substitution of ideology for truth, the replacement of personal responsibility with victimhood narratives, and most critically, the rejection of absolute moral standards in favor of relativistic chaos. Yet history teaches us that such collapses, while devastating, also create opportunities for renewal, if we have the wisdom to learn from the past and the courage to apply its lessons. Chapter 1: The Foundation That Once Was. To understand our current predicament, we must first comprehend what we've lost. For nearly 2,000 years, Western civilization rested upon a remarkable synthesis of Jerusalem and Athens, Hebrew moral insight wedded to Greek rational inquiry, all transformed by Christian revelation. This wasn't merely an intellectual exercise, it created a unique cultural framework that valued both truth and compassion, both reason and faith, both individual dignity and social responsibility. The genius of this synthesis lay in its recognition that human beings require both absolute moral standards and the freedom to pursue truth through reason. The 10 Commandments provided non-negotiable ethical foundations, while Greek philosophy offered methods for understanding the natural world. Christianity unified these streams by insisting that truth is both discoverable and personal, embodied in Christ himself, who declared, "I am the truth." This worldview produced extraordinary results. It created the first civilization that systematically opposed slavery on moral grounds. It established institutions of learning that became our great universities. It developed the concept of natural law that would later inspire the American Declaration of Independence. Most importantly, it insisted that every human being, regardless of social status, possessed inherent dignity as an image-bearer of God. Consider the practical fruits of this moral consensus. The hospital system emerged from Christian charity. The scientific revolution flourished because Christians believed in a rational creator who had established discoverable laws. Democratic institutions developed because the Christian understanding of human nature, fallen yet redeemable, provided the perfect balance between optimism and realism necessary for self-governance. This wasn't a perfect civilization, no human institution ever is. But it was a civilization with clear moral coordinates, one that could distinguish between right and wrong, truth and falsehood, beauty and ugliness. It provided what every healthy society requires, a shared understanding of human nature, moral purpose, and ultimate meaning. The erosion began gradually. First came the Enlightenment's overconfidence in human reason divorced from divine revelation. Then the Romantic movement's elevation of emotion over both faith and reason. By the 20th century, 2 world wars had shattered confidence in progress, while Marxism and Freudianism offered secular alternatives to Christian anthropology. Yet the final blow came not from external enemies but from internal capitulation. When Western intellectuals embraced relativism, the notion that truth itself is merely a cultural construct, they destroyed the very foundation upon which their civilization stood. Once you abandon the possibility of objective truth, moral standards become arbitrary preferences, and culture becomes merely the battlefield where competing power groups struggle for dominance. Chapter 2: the Great Abandonment. The transformation I witnessed during my lifetime wasn't gradual decline, it was deliberate abandonment. Having spent decades observing intellectuals, politicians, and cultural leaders, I can testify that many of them consciously rejected the moral framework that had sustained Western civilization. This wasn't ignorance, it was apostasy. The pivotal moment came in the 1960s, though the intellectual groundwork had been laid much earlier. Suddenly, the institutions that had transmitted traditional values, family, church, school, found themselves under systematic attack. Marriage was redefined from a sacred covenant to a personal contract. Education shifted from transmitting wisdom to questioning all authority. Churches abandoned doctrinal clarity for therapeutic reassurance. I watched this unfold firsthand in my years as a journalist and later as a historian trying to understand how societies lose their way. The pattern was always the same. First, intellectuals would attack traditional values in the name of liberation. Then institutions would compromise their standards to appear relevant. Finally, the general population would inherit a culture stripped of moral bearings. The sexual revolution exemplified this process perfectly. What began as academic theories about human nature quickly became social policies that redefined the family. The consequences were predictable to anyone who understood history: rising divorce rates, declining birth rates, fatherless children, and the feminization of poverty. Yet rather than acknowledge these failures, the cultural elite doubled down, insisting that the problems required even more radical solutions. The same pattern repeated in education. Progressive educators dismantled curricula that had transmitted cultural knowledge for generations, replacing them with ideological programs designed to produce social activists rather than educated citizens. Students learned to critique Western civilization without understanding what made it distinctive or valuable. Perhaps most tragically, many religious institutions surrendered their prophetic voice. Desperate to remain culturally relevant, they abandoned theological clarity for social activism. Instead of offering eternal truth in the face of temporal confusion, they amplified the very cultural voices that were destroying the moral consensus their faith had created. The result was a generation raised without moral coordinates. These young people inherited unprecedented material prosperity but lacked the spiritual and intellectual framework necessary to handle such abundance responsibly. They were taught that all values are relative while being expected to make absolute moral choices. They were told that truth is subjective while living in a world that operates according to objective natural laws. What makes this abandonment particularly tragic is that it was unnecessary. Western civilization wasn't dying from external assault, it was committing suicide. The very prosperity and freedom that our moral traditions had created were being used to destroy those traditions. We were witnessing the historical irony of a civilization too successful for its own good, too comfortable to maintain the disciplines that had made such comfort possible. Chapter 3: When Truth Became Personal Opinion. The death of truth as an objective reality represents perhaps the most catastrophic intellectual development of our time. Having spent my career studying how ideas shape history, I can attest that no civilization can survive the abandonment of truth as a governing principle. Yet this is precisely what happened in the latter half of the 20th century, when Western intellectuals embraced the fatal notion that truth is merely a social construct. This wasn't a sudden development but the culmination of philosophical trends that began with Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead, and reached their logical conclusion with postmodernism's insistence that all truth claims are really power claims. The practical effect was to transform every discussion about reality into a political struggle between competing narratives. I witnessed this transformation personally during my years in journalism and academia. Scholarly debates that had once focused on evidence and logic increasingly became exercises in ideological positioning. Historical facts that contradicted progressive narratives were dismissed as perspectives, rather than evaluated on their merits. The very concept of objective scholarship became suspect, replaced by explicitly partisan approaches that judged ideas by their political usefulness rather than their truthfulness. The consequences extended far beyond academic seminars. When truth becomes merely personal opinion, public discourse becomes impossible. Democracy requires citizens who can distinguish between fact and propaganda, who can evaluate competing claims based on evidence rather than tribal loyalty. Once this capacity is lost, democratic institutions become mere facades for tribal warfare. Consider how this played out in American culture. Scientific findings about human nature were rejected if they contradicted egalitarian ideology. Historical evidence about the success of traditional institutions was dismissed as privilege rather than examined honestly. Economic data demonstrating the superiority of free markets was explained away as capitalist propaganda. The destruction of truth had particularly devastating effects on moral reasoning. If there are no objective moral standards, then moral arguments become exercises in emotional manipulation rather than rational persuasion. The strongest voice wins, not the most truthful one. This explains why our contemporary moral debates generate so much heat but so little light. They're not really about discovering truth but about imposing one group's preferences on another. Christianity understood from the beginning that truth and morality are inseparable. "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free," Christ declared, recognizing that human flourishing depends on aligning our lives with reality rather than wishful thinking. When societies abandon this principle, they inevitably experience the consequences of living according to lies. The tragedy is that this abandonment was completely unnecessary. Western civilization had developed sophisticated methods for distinguishing truth from error, knowledge from opinion, fact from interpretation. These methods weren't perfect, no human institution ever is, but they were demonstrably superior to the alternatives. By abandoning them, we didn't gain intellectual humility, we lost the capacity for rational discourse altogether. Today's Americans inherit this wreckage. They live in a culture where every institution, media, education, entertainment, has abandoned the pursuit of truth in favor of advancing ideological agendas. The result is a population increasingly unable to distinguish between reality and propaganda, increasingly susceptible to manipulation by whoever controls the flow of information. Chapter 4: The Intellectual Class Betrays Its Mission. Throughout my career studying the intellectual class, culminating in my book, Intellectuals, I've observed a pattern that explains much about our current cultural crisis. Those entrusted with preserving and transmitting civilization's highest achievements have systematically betrayed that trust, using their positions to undermine the very foundations of the culture that elevated them. The Western intellectual tradition once understood its mission clearly: to seek truth, preserve wisdom, and transmit both to future generations. From Augustine to Aquinas, from Newton to Johnson, great minds saw themselves as stewards of a magnificent heritage, responsible for adding to human knowledge while maintaining continuity with the past. This changed dramatically in the 20th century, when intellectuals began seeing themselves as revolutionary vanguards tasked with overthrowing oppressive, traditional structures. I witnessed this transformation personally during my years at Cambridge and later as editor of The New Statesman. Brilliant minds that should have been defending Western achievements instead devoted their energies to critiquing them. Scholars who had benefited enormously from traditional institutions, universities, museums, libraries, used their privileged positions to attack the very values that had created those institutions. The betrayal took many forms. In literature, critics abandoned the pursuit of beauty and truth in favor of political messaging. In history, scholars replaced the study of what actually happened with ideological narratives designed to advance contemporary political goals. In philosophy, thinkers abandoned the search for wisdom in favor of sophisticated word games that obscured rather than illuminated reality. Perhaps most perniciously, Intellectuals began teaching that intellectual activity itself was suspect, that reason, logic, and evidence were tools of oppression rather than liberation. They convinced entire generations that thinking clearly was a form of violence against marginalized groups. The result was the extraordinary spectacle of universities, institutions created to cultivate rational thought, actively discouraging their students from thinking rationally. The consequences extended far beyond academic seminars. When intellectuals abandon their responsibility to distinguish truth from falsehood, the entire culture loses its capacity for critical thinking. Politicians feel free to make claims without evidence. Activists substitute emotional appeals for rational arguments. Citizens become increasingly susceptible to propaganda and manipulation. Consider the moral dimension of this betrayal. Intellectuals enjoy extraordinary privileges, tenure, respect, platforms for their ideas, precisely because society recognizes the importance of independent thought. When they abuse these privileges by serving ideological masters rather than pursuing truth, they violate a fundamental social compact. They take society's gifts while undermining society's foundations. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you examine intellectuals' personal lives. My research consistently revealed a gap between their public pronouncements and private behavior. Those who preached egalitarianism lived lavishly. Those who criticized traditional morality often treated their own families shamefully. Those who attacked capitalism eagerly pursued wealth and status for themselves. This isn't mere hypocrisy, it's something more dangerous. When intellectuals don't believe their own ideas strongly enough to live by them, they reveal those ideas' essential falseness. Yet they continue promoting these ideas to others, using their authority to spread beliefs they privately reject. This represents perhaps the deepest form of intellectual corruption possible. The tragedy is that genuine intellectual work remains desperately needed. Complex challenges require careful thinking, and democratic societies particularly need citizens capable of rational discourse. But when the intellectual class abandons its mission, who will provide the clear thinking our culture requires? The answer, I believe, lies not in reforming institutions that have been captured by ideologues, but in creating new ones committed to the timeless principles of truth-seeking and wisdom preservation. Chapter 5: The American Exception Under Assault. America represented something unprecedented in human history, a nation founded explicitly on moral principles derived from the Judeo-Christian tradition yet designed to accommodate diverse beliefs through constitutional protections. Having written extensively about American history, I can attest that this achievement was both remarkable and fragile. Today, we're witnessing whether this experiment can survive the systematic assault on its founding principles. The genius of the American founding lay in its synthesis of biblical anthropology with Enlightenment political theory. The founders understood, from both scripture and experience, that human beings are fallen creatures capable of both nobility and corruption. This realistic assessment led them to create a system of checks and balances that could harness human ambition for beneficial purposes while preventing the concentration of power that inevitably leads to tyranny. The Declaration of Independence grounded this system in transcendent truth, declaring that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. This wasn't merely poetic language. It was a profound philosophical statement recognizing that legitimate government must rest on foundations higher than human will. Rights come from God, not from majority vote or elite opinion. This principle made America a beacon of hope for oppressed peoples worldwide. The Constitution operationalized these insights through a federal system that divided power both horizontally and vertically, creating multiple centers of authority that must cooperate to function effectively. This required a citizenry capable of self-governance, people who possessed both the moral character to respect others' rights and the intellectual capacity to make informed decisions about complex issues. For over 2 centuries, this system worked remarkably well. America became the freest, most prosperous, most innovative society in human history. It attracted immigrants from every corner of the globe, offering them opportunities unavailable anywhere else. It defeated fascism and communism, the two great totalitarian threats of the 20th century. It created abundance that lifted living standards not just domestically but globally. Yet success bred complacency, and complacency invited corruption. By the 1960s, influential Americans began questioning whether their country's founding principles were legitimate. Instead of seeing America as humanity's best hope for ordered liberty, they portrayed it as an oppressive system founded on stolen land with stolen labor. Instead of celebrating the unprecedented expansion of human freedom, they focused exclusively on historical failures and injustices. This critique gained institutional power through universities, media organizations, and government agencies staffed by people who believed America needed fundamental transformation rather than gradual improvement. They systematically undermined the cultural foundations that had made American success possible: respect for constitutional limits, appreciation for market economics, understanding of traditional morality, and confidence in American exceptionalism. The assault took multiple forms. Education curricula shifted from teaching civic virtues to cataloging American sins. Entertainment media portrayed traditional American values as repressive rather than liberating. Legal institutions reinterpreted constitutional principles to achieve policy outcomes the democratic process had rejected. Religious institutions often joined the assault, abandoning their role as guardians of transcendent truth in favor of progressive activism. Perhaps most damaging was the attack on American historical memory. Instead of understanding their nation's story as one of gradual progress toward fulfilling founding ideals, Americans were taught to see it as an unbroken chain of oppression requiring revolutionary transformation. This created a population ashamed of their heritage rather than inspired by it, eager to abandon proven principles rather than apply them more consistently. The practical consequences are visible everywhere. Constitutional government gives way to administrative rule by unelected bureaucrats. Market economics surrenders to crony capitalism and government intervention. Individual responsibility yields to group identity and victimhood narratives. Religious liberty becomes mere freedom of worship confined to private spaces. Yet America's founding principles retain their power to inspire because they rest on truths about human nature that transcend cultural fashions. The question is whether enough Americans still understand and embrace these principles to reverse the current decline. History suggests that such reversals are possible, but only when people clearly understand what they're fighting to preserve and why it matters for human flourishing. Chapter 6: The Replacement of Virtue with Therapy. One of the most profound transformations I've witnessed in Western culture is the replacement of virtue ethics with therapeutic thinking. Where once we asked whether actions were right or wrong, we now ask whether they make us feel better. This shift represents more than changing vocabulary. It reflects a fundamental reorientation of human purpose that has devastated our capacity for moral reasoning and character formation. Classical virtue ethics, refined by Christian thought over centuries, recognize that human flourishing requires the cultivation of excellent character traits through disciplined practice. Courage, temperance, justice, and prudence weren't mere personal preferences but objective excellences that enabled individuals to live well and contribute to social harmony. This understanding shaped everything from child-rearing to legal systems, creating cultures that prioritized long-term character development over short-term satisfaction. The therapeutic revolution changed everything. Beginning with Freudian psychology and accelerating through various therapeutic movements, Western culture began treating moral problems as psychological symptoms requiring professional intervention rather than character defects requiring personal effort. Sin became sickness, evil became pathology, and moral education became therapy. I observed this transformation throughout my career, watching as institutions abandoned their traditional role as character-forming environments. Schools stopped teaching virtue and began providing counseling services. Churches replaced moral instruction with support groups. Families sought professional help for problems that previous generations handled through prayer, discipline, and community wisdom. The consequences were predictable but tragic. When you treat moral failures as psychological symptoms, you remove personal responsibility from the equation. People learn to see themselves as victims of their circumstances rather than agents capable of moral choice. Instead of developing the internal resources necessary for ethical living, they become dependent on external validation and professional intervention. Consider how this played out in American culture. Instead of teaching children that actions have consequences and character matters, we began medicating behavioral problems and providing therapy for normal developmental challenges. Instead of expecting young people to develop self-control through practice and discipline, we offered pharmaceutical solutions and emotional support services. The therapeutic mindset also transformed our understanding of relationships. Marriage stopped being a covenant requiring sacrifice and commitment and became a contract for mutual satisfaction that could be dissolved when feelings changed. Parenting shifted from authority-based guidance toward child-centered negotiation. Communities ceased functioning as networks of mutual obligation and became collections of individuals pursuing personal fulfillment. Perhaps most damaging was therapy's impact on moral discourse itself. Traditional morality speaks in terms of duties, obligations, and objective standards that transcend personal preferences. Therapeutic thinking speaks in terms of feelings, needs, and subjective experiences that vary by individual. When these vocabularies meet, therapeutic language inevitably wins because it feels more compassionate and non-judgmental. Yet this apparent compassion often proves cruelly deceptive. By treating people as psychological patients rather than moral agents, therapeutic culture strips them of the dignity that comes from being held responsible for their choices. It creates permanent invalids rather than enabling people to develop the strength necessary for genuine flourishing. The Christian understanding of human nature offers a superior alternative. It recognizes that people are fallen creatures who struggle with moral failure, but it insists that they retain the capacity for moral growth through divine grace and human effort. This perspective combines realistic assessment of human weakness with optimistic confidence in human potential for transformation. Christianity also understands that true healing often requires confronting uncomfortable truths rather than avoiding them. The therapeutic culture's emphasis on self-esteem frequently prevents the honest self-examination necessary for genuine growth. By contrast, Christian virtue ethics insists that acknowledging moral failure is the first step toward moral progress. The path forward requires recovering the classical understanding that character formation is life's primary task and that this formation requires disciplined practice of virtue regardless of immediate feelings. This doesn't mean abandoning legitimate psychological insights, but it does mean subordinating therapeutic approaches to moral frameworks rather than allowing therapy to replace morality altogether. Chapter 7: The Path to Cultural Renewal. Despite the cultural collapse we've examined, history teaches us that renewal remains possible. Having studied numerous civilizations that faced similar crises, I can identify patterns that suggest how moral and intellectual recovery might occur. The key insight is that cultural transformation always begins with individuals who refuse to accept decline as inevitable and commit themselves to preserving and transmitting eternal truths regardless of contemporary fashions. The first requirement for renewal is honest diagnosis. We must acknowledge that our current crisis results not from external enemies but from internal abandonment of the principles that built Western civilization. This isn't a failure of particular policies or politicians but a spiritual and intellectual crisis that requires spiritual and intellectual solutions. Political action remains important, but it cannot substitute for the deeper work of cultural reconstruction. Recovery begins with education, but not the kind currently provided by most institutions. We need education that transmits the best of human achievement rather than deconstructing it, that teaches students to think clearly rather than feel correctly, that connects them with the great tradition of Western thought rather than alienating them from it. This may require creating new institutions rather than reforming captured ones. The family represents the most crucial battleground for cultural renewal. Strong families transmit values across generations more effectively than any institution. Parents who understand their civilization's heritage and possess the courage to pass it on can insulate their children from cultural decay while preparing them to be agents of renewal. This requires recovering the understanding that child rearing is primarily about character formation rather than self-expression. Religious institutions must reclaim their prophetic voice. Too many churches have surrendered their transcendent mission for temporal relevance, becoming echo chambers for secular culture rather than sources of divine truth. Renewal requires religious leaders who understand that their primary responsibility is to form souls for eternity, not to achieve political victories or social approval. The intellectual class presents perhaps the greatest challenge because it has been most thoroughly corrupted. Yet history shows that even small groups of committed thinkers can eventually transform entire cultures. What's needed are scholars who combine intellectual rigor with moral courage, who seek truth rather than advancement, who understand that ideas have consequences and therefore handle ideas responsibly. Americans possess unique advantages for cultural renewal. Their founding documents explicitly ground legitimate government in transcendent truth, providing a constitutional framework that supports rather than undermines traditional values. Their federal system allows experimentation with different approaches, enabling successful models to spread gradually. Their religious heritage remains stronger than in most Western nations, providing institutional resources for moral education. The renewal process requires what I call conscious traditionalism, deliberate choice to embrace inherited wisdom rather than innovative theories. This isn't mere nostalgia but intelligent recognition that practices and beliefs that have sustained human flourishing across centuries deserve presumptive respect. Innovation remains valuable, but it should build upon traditional foundations rather than rejecting them. Economic considerations also support renewal. The therapeutic culture's emphasis on emotional satisfaction over productive achievement creates unsustainable dependency ratios and declining competitiveness. Societies that rediscover the connection between virtue and prosperity will enjoy natural advantages over those trapped in therapeutic victimhood cycles. The media landscape offers unprecedented opportunities for alternative voices. Technology has broken the gatekeeping power of established institutions, enabling thoughtful people to reach audiences directly. This creates possibilities for rebuilding cultural consensus from the ground up rather than waiting for institutional reform from the top down. Perhaps most importantly, renewal requires faith, not necessarily religious faith, though that helps enormously, but faith in the possibility that truth, beauty, and goodness remain powerful forces in human affairs. Cultures that have lost confidence in their own values cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. Those that rediscover such confidence often surprise themselves with how quickly renewal can occur. The choice before Americans is stark but not hopeless. They can continue down the path of cultural dissolution, abandoning the principles that made their civilization possible, or they can choose the harder path of conscious renewal, recommitting themselves to eternal truths that transcend contemporary fashions. History suggests that such choices, while difficult, remain available to every generation willing to make them. Conclusion. The cultural collapse we've examined was neither inevitable nor irreversible. It resulted from specific choices made by particular people who abandoned proven principles in favor of fashionable theories. Because it was caused by human decisions, it can be corrected by different human decisions, if we possess the wisdom to learn from history and the courage to apply its lessons. The path forward requires recovering what we've lost: confidence in objective truth, commitment to virtue ethics, respect for traditional wisdom, and faith in transcendent purpose. These aren't antiquated relics but timeless requirements for human flourishing that remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. Cultures that embrace these principles thrive, those that abandon them decline. Americans stand at a crossroads. They can choose continued descent into relativistic chaos, therapeutic victimhood, and cultural self-hatred, or they can choose the difficult path of renewal based on their founding principles. This choice cannot be made by politicians or institutions, it must be made by individuals, families, and communities committed to transmitting civilization's greatest achievements to future generations. The stakes could not be higher. Western civilization represents humanity's greatest achievement in ordered liberty, and America represents Western civilization's greatest political expression. If this experiment fails, the prospects for human freedom and dignity darken considerably. Yet if it succeeds, it offers hope not just for Americans but for all people seeking to combine freedom with order, prosperity with virtue, progress with tradition. History teaches us that such renewals are possible but never easy. They require intellectual honesty, moral courage, and spiritual faith that transcend immediate circumstances. They demand leaders who care more about truth than popularity, more about character than success, more about future generations than present comfort. The choice is ours. We can be the generation that allowed Western civilization to collapse through negligence and cowardice, or we can be the generation that chose renewal through wisdom and courage. The verdict of history awaits our decision.